Let's talk a little bit about what the brain actually does. One of the distinguishing things between animals and plants is that animals tend to move. Most plants don't move. There are some carnivorous plants, such as the Venus flytrap, that do move, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, animals are really good at moving. They have muscles that contract, and this leads to movement. And so the brain controls that movement. So, for example, you can have what's called voluntary movement. This is when you think that you want to do something, like kick a ball, and then you go ahead and do that. So your brain actually sort of plans that out and then executes what's called a motor program for you to hopefully smoothly kick that ball and get the goal or whatever you're trying to do. There's also movement that's related to reflexes. So we have reflexes such as the knee-jerk reflex, which we'll talk about more later. And though that sort of movement, again, is controlled by the nervous system. It doesn't actually involve the brain, but it involves the spinal cord. And we'll talk about that reflex later. Now, the brain is also involved in control. The brain regulates bodily functions such as breathing, heartbeat rate, blood pressure, digestion, excretion. So all these things are controlled by the brain and the nervous system. The brain also controls basic drives such as hunger, thirst, sex drive, and sleep. Moving on to thinking. So the brain, of course, is where thoughts and imagination take place, where you may have an inner monologue and so forth. All that would, of course, be done by the brain. There's moving on to sensory experience. We have sensory information coming from the environment that's detected by the body. So, for example, we can detect light, we can detect sound, we can detect pressure, and so forth. Now, there's also sensory experience that comes from within the body. So you also have sensors within the body that detect things like blood pressure. So that's incredibly important. And that also is information that's very useful for the brain to use to then have the appropriate response. The brain's also involved in communication. So we're communicate with others through speech, through nonverbal communication, written language, and so forth. Emotions are incredibly important. So we need emotions to help guide us in many situations. So, for example, it's probably less important now, although you may get yourself in situations where you should feel fear, like you're in a bad part of town, and maybe you should get out of that part of town because it's nightfall is coming and so forth. Well, these sorts of emotions like fear were really important from an evolutionary perspective. So if you were someone who didn't fear and you just laid out, went to sleep in the middle of the forest, well, you might have been eaten by wolves. So feeling things like fear was incredibly important. And so, of course, that's a big function of what your brain does. It makes you feel things like fear. You can also feel happiness, which helps you, say, bond with other people. You can then form a social group, and you can share resources and so forth. And that, again, would help you very much. So emotions are incredibly important. Let's move on to memory. So memory is important for survival. You may have to remember where those blueberry bushes were, that sort of thing. If you were talking about it way back in the past, people would have to know where to find roots to eat, where the best hunting was, and so forth. And memory, of course, also has the function of allowing you to predict what you should do in the future. Like if you know fall is coming, it's going to be cold soon, maybe you should start to build a shelter and so forth. Now that we've talked a bit about why the brain is so important for all the different function it does for the body, we can talk a little bit more about what happens when things go wrong. So the human brain is extremely complex, and with any complex organ, there are things that can go wrong. And so this means that diseases of the brain are very common. These diseases include multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, stroke. They can affect a person's memory and their ability to perform daily activities. Additionally, if we think about children, it turns out the complexity of the brain makes it very vulnerable to environmental conditions, particularly in children. So children are very vulnerable to a lack of nutrients. So if So, for example, children need certain nutrients like omega-3 and so forth, which is a type of fatty acid that helps them with their brain development. Children also are very susceptible to the presence of toxins. And an example of this would be what happened in 2014 with the tap water in Flint, Michigan. It was found to have unsafe levels of lead in it, and this caused a long-term impact on the children's health. So, for example, we know that lead will damage the brain and nervous system. It'll slow growth and development. It will cause learning and behavioral problems, speech problems, hearing problems. And when they looked 3 years after this crisis began at third graders in Flint, the ones that normally the percentage that passed the Michigan Standard Literacy Test is 41%, and this dropped to only 10%. So this showed pretty convincingly, pretty strongly that these children were in fact hurt by the presence of lead in their water. I'd like to give you a little bit of a heads up on what we're going to be discussing in the next little bit. So to begin to understand our brains and ourselves, we need to become familiar with a few topics. So we need to have some common language, some terminology, and understand a few basic principles. So we're going to talk about neuroanatomy. We're going to go into neurons or nerve cells and how they work. We'll talk a bit about the connections between neurons, which are called synapses. We'll talk a bit about neural networks, which are interconnected neurons. Now, neural networks can form what are called modules. So there's a theory in cognitive neuroscience that basically there are different modules within the mind or the brain, and these modules interact to allow us to do various functions. And then we'll also go into a little bit about the evolution of the nervous system, and this will help us have some context for how our brains and nervous systems relate to the brains and nervous systems of other animals. Let's begin with the evolution of the nervous system. So the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. About a billion years after that, at 3.5 billion years ago, we have the earliest undisputed evidence of single-celled organisms on Earth. These were simple cells like bacteria. There's single-celled organisms, and they were prokaryotic, meaning that they had no nucleus. They were just essentially, and they had no organelles, so they were just very simple cells. About a billion years after that, so this is 2.5 billion years ago, we had the beginnings of single-celled eukaryotic life. Now, eukaryotes are cells that have a nuclei. So they have a nucleus. They also have organelles like mitochondria and things like that. So they're quite a bit more complex than these prokaryotes, which are bacteria and other sort of similar organisms to bacteria. And then, interestingly, it took a very long time before we had the first multicellular organisms arising. So we have fossil evidence that about 600 million years ago, we did have multicellular organisms. And we don't know for sure, but very likely many of these early multicellular organisms may have had some sort of primitive nervous system, although that's a little bit harder to see in the fossil record. Here's an example here. We can see this. One of the earliest animals that's been found was called Dickinsonia. It lived 558 million years ago, and these grew to be quite large. They could be as big as 1.4 meters in length, and they would move across the seafloor, feeding on whatever kind of organic material they could find. So again, we talked about movement as being one of the basic functions of the nervous system. So this animal moved. We don't really know if it had a nervous system or not, but it's definitely possible. It may have had a nervous system because it did move as it was eating, and there was good evidence for that. They know that it moved. So probably very early on, we had either nervous systems or something similar to a nervous system, some sort of a coordination between cells that would allow for movement. Now, if we look at modern day animals, almost all animals have nervous systems, and there are a few exceptions, which are sort of notable just in the fact that they don't have a nervous system. And this would be sponges, and there are these tiny marine animals called placozoans, and we'll talk about that next. As I mentioned, there are two types of animals that have no nervous systems. One is sponges. These are among the most primitive of all animals. They're filter feeders. They're immobile. What they do is they uh, uh, essentially filter food, water, which contains food, through their bodies, and then they derive their food that way. So they don't move at all, and they have no neurons or nervous system. So again, this sort of helps to illustrate this idea that perhaps movement is one of the reasons why animals such as we have nervous systems. It was originally derived from the idea that our ancient ancestors were creatures that moved, and maybe they needed a nervous system to help coordinate that movement. Now, if we look at another type of very simple animal, the placozoans also have no neurons or nervous system. These are tiny marine animals. They search for food by moving, and these actually do move. They can move two ways. They can glide on cilia, which are little hair-like projections on their undersides, or they can move like in an amoeboid fashion, which means they sort of parts of their body will jet out and other parts will follow and so forth. But again, so here's a case where an animal does move, and yet it has no neurons or nervous system. We'll come back and talk about the placozoans a bit more. One of the challenges of being a multicellular organism, in other words, an animal that consists of more than one cell, is that you have cells that are specialized for different functions. So, for example, you have some cells that will be involved in feeding, others in moving, others in reproduction. So when you have all these different cells that have different specialized functions, they need to communicate with one another. And so all multicellular organisms, including the sponge, including the placozoa, do have to have some sort of system of communication between cells. And it's thought by studying animals as simple as the sponge and the placozoa that we can actually get some idea of how nervous systems may have originated. So if we look at the placozoa, it does move, and it has to coordinate its body shape and movement between the various cells within its body. How does it do that? Well, it turns out that it does have a signaling system. So there are cells that release chemicals, which are small peptides. Peptides are chains of amino acids. And these are detected by neighboring cells, and they would therefore have an effect on the neighboring cell. And this allows the animal to coordinate its movement as well as other bodily functions. And so it's thought that this sort of signaling is maybe the origin of a nervous system. You have to first have some sort of communication between cells, and eventually you get to the point where we have more advanced animals where you actually have neurons, cells that are specialized for communication. Moving on from animals that don't have neurons or a nervous system, let's talk about the animals that do have a simple form of nervous system. The simplest form of a nervous system is called a nerve net. A nerve net consists of interconnected neurons that form a network, but no brain. So there's no centralization of neurons. In other words, the neurons aren't grouped together in a centralized manner. Nerve nets are found in animals called cnidarians. These include jellyfish, corals, sea anemones, and hydra. Now we're going to come back and talk about some of these animals more, because it turns out that some of them may in fact have the beginnings of centralization, in other words, a central nervous system. But we'll hold that thought and come back to it in a second. Moving on to more advanced animals, we can talk a little bit now about the evolution of what's called the central nervous system. So over evolutionary time, some animals started to develop centralized groups of neurons. And so these animals could be said to have a true central nervous system. Now, if we look at different animals and their body plans, it turns out that in general, animals that have these centralization of neurons forming a central nervous system, that will occur in animals that are bilaterally symmetric. So what does that mean? Well, a bilaterally symmetric animal is an animal that has a left side and a right side that are basically more or less mirror images of one another. So for example, humans are bilaterally symmetric. A beetle here, as shown here, is bilaterally symmetric. It has a left side that's very similar, or it's very much just the mirror image of the right side. Now, there are other types of symmetry. You have animals that have no symmetry whatsoever. A sponge has no symmetry. Their body plan you can't simply divide it up very easily and say, well, one side is similar to the other. Lots of animals actually have another form of symmetry. So for example, here's a picture of a coral polyp that has what's called radial symmetry. So this means that the animal can be divided up into sort of like pie-shaped bits that are similar to one another. So we found in general, again, that animals that are bilateral symmetric have central nervous systems. Animals in general that have radial symmetry are going to have nerve nets, which we discussed earlier, which is a more simple or primitive form of nervous system. So let's look at some other examples. So as I mentioned, we are bilaterally symmetric, and it turns out the fish are bilaterally symmetric, and it turns out that all land animals that are tetrapods, meaning that they have 4 feet, including amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals, all have bilateral symmetry. Tetrapods are all evolved from fish, and so that's not really very surprising. So fish are bilaterally symmetric, and so all these land animals that are tetrapods are also bilaterally symmetric. And so it turns out that we actually not only are we bilaterally symmetric, but we share a lot of the same brain structures as a fish. So essentially, the human brain is, in essence, a fish brain, and over evolution, it changed into more of a reptilian brain, and then mammals evolved from reptilian like ancestors, but we've conserved a lot of the same brain structures over evolutionary time. As I mentioned earlier, we generally consider animals that have a nerve net, which is this diffuse network of neurons, to be more primitive than animals that have a central nervous system, such as humans. Now, it turns out that actually, if you look in a little more detail, some of these animals, even the hydra, which is the classic animal that we think of as having a nerve net, actually has the beginnings of a primitive central nervous system. So a hydra will have what's called a nerve ring. If you look at a jellyfish, it actually has 2 nerve rings, an inner and outer nerve ring. So these nerve rings are concentrations of neurons. So they're not, so these animals, which we classically think of as having a nerve net, actually do have the very beginnings of sort of a primitive central nervous system. And why would you do that? Well, presumably the idea is that you would have neurons that are close to one another to shorten the distances between them, and this would allow for faster processing. It takes time for a neuron to send a signal from one cell to another. So if the neurons are closer together, they're packed together, they're able to compute and process information faster. So both the hydra and the jellyfish shown here, these are both cnidarians. It turns out if you look at quite a different type of animal, it looks similar because it's radially symmetric. A starfish is actually a very different type of animal. It's an echinoderm, and it's actually more closely related to humans than it is to cnidarians. But it looks a bit like a cnidarian because it's radially symmetric. And interestingly enough, if you look at a starfish, it actually has a nerve ring also. So again, these animals have perhaps the beginnings of what we might consider a primitive central nervous system. Although most textbooks will say that these animals have nerve nets, and that's true also. They have a nerve net, And then they also have the beginnings of a primitive central nervous system. As I mentioned earlier, if we look at bilateral animals, they tend to have central nervous systems. So why would that be? Well, the basic idea is that throughout evolutionary time, bilateral animals tended to move, and they would have one end that would be the head end and one end that would be the tail end. And so as they move through the environment, the head end would encounter odors, would encounter light, would encounter tactile information and things like that, which is touch, more than the tail end would, or at least different information that the tail end would. And typically the head end of an animal would also have the mouth. And so over time, you had specialization of the head end of the animal. And it started to be distinguished from other parts of the animal. So this general trend is called cephalization. And so this is an evolutionary trend in which over many, many generations, you have the development of the mouth, sense organs, the nerve ganglia. Ganglia are bundles or groups of nerve cells or neurons that are concentrated together in a bundle. And so you have a concentration of these things towards the front end of the animal, essentially towards the head end. And so eventually you have this head region that's very distinct from the rest of the body. And so you see cephalization in probably the majority of bilaterally symmetric animals. So for example, if you look at a fly, there's a very clear head end. It has special sense organs such as the antennae. It has the mouth. The mouth has associated with it various sense organs. It has within the head, in a fly, it has what's called a cerebral ganglion. Again, a ganglion is a group of cells that are often interconnected. They process information together. And so you have a special ganglion called a cerebral ganglion. And that another word for a cerebral ganglion is brain. We consider insects to have brains, which are called the cerebral ganglia. Now, another example, of course, of an animal that we're interested in that's bilaterally symmetric is the human. So again, we have a left and right side that are very similar. They're mirror images of one another. We developed from animals that, again, probably moved with the head end forward over time. Searching for food and so forth, and over evolutionary time, you have the development of a lot of sense organs towards the head end. So, for example, we have eyes, nose, ears, mouth parts, brain, and they're all concentrated at the head end. And so humans are considered to be cephalized animals. We have undergone this process of cephalization, just as most other bilaterally symmetric animals, such as insects. We've discussed the idea that the brain is very fragile. It's physically very fragile. It's the consistency of soft jello. So why would you put such an organ that's so fragile in the head, where it's going to perhaps encounter trauma and so forth? But it turns out that if you look at animals that are bilaterally symmetric, the brain is always located near the sense organs. In other words, it's right behind the eyes, near the olfactory organs, such as the nose. And the reason for this seems to be that nerve signals take a certain amount of time to travel. And so by having the brain very close to the sense organs, you save time. And why would you want to save time? Well, that could actually mean the difference between life and death. So, for example, here's a picture of a deep sea fish that's essentially swallowed or in the process of eating an entire shark. And so if you're slow and it takes you a long time to process visual information, well, you may be dead. And so that's why in pretty much all organisms, the brain is located right behind the sense organs. It's very close to the eyes and so forth.